Hello everyone, and welcome to the second module in the second half of our course looking at paths to peace in the international system. We're going to be turning to ways in which we see the international community respond to contain conflict, particularly looking at the role of the UN and efforts towards peacekeeping and more recently humanitarian intervention. So a few things we're going to talk about in Module 7. First, is the role of the United Nations post-World War II as one of the key protectors of international peace and stability. So we'll talk a little bit about the emerging role of the United Nations, some of the key powers that are held there. Second, we'll move towards talking about the evolution of peacekeeping post-World War II and particularly in the middle of the Cold War and post-Cold War. The evolution from peacekeeping, particularly towards so-called peace operations and peace enforcement. And last, we'll talk about one of those specific aspects of peace enforcement that we've seen emerge in the post-Cold War world, humanitarian intervention, and the more recent doctrine of the responsibility to protect. So the United Nations has played an incredibly important role in terms of containing conflict post-1945. The United Nations, as many of you know, was founded after World War II by the Allied powers and accompanying UN member states. As of 2015, there's over 193 member states of the United Nations. So most of the states around the world are now signed on as member states of the UN. And the UN, very important, it was created as part of the New World Order emerging post-World War II, and it was given the task primarily, among many of the other things that it does, with helping to promote international order, peace, and stability. Essentially, if you could boil down why did we see the United Nations form post-World War II, it was an effort to create an international organization to essentially try to stop and protect World War III from ever breaking out in the future. And so as part of this, as part of the UN's role of protecting international order, peace, and stability, we do see in the UN Charter a very clear commitment to protecting the sovereignty and territory of states around the world, and also a strong principle towards non-aggression among member states. And very interestingly, what the United Nations also did under the UN Charter is establish the UN as the only legitimate arbiter of force in the post-World War II world. Essentially, after the creation of the United Nations, it's now become illegal under international law for states to launch wars of aggression against one another. Really, the only time a war can ever be legitimate or justified in the post-world order is either in defense or if it's authorized by the United Nations. So it gives it some pretty significant powers to protect international order, peace, and stability. And a key agency within the United Nations is the UN Security Council, which under the UN Charter is given the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. So lots of other organizations within the UN, but it's really the UN Security Council which is the beating heart and the primary organ that's tasked with protecting international peace and security. And a couple key provisions in the Charter which gives the UN Security Council the powers it needs to try to protect and maintain international peace and security. One of those is found under Chapter 6, which allows the UN Security Council to take any actions deemed necessary to help settle disputes between member states that are likely to endanger international security. Though, interestingly, under this is to be done with the consent of those disputing parties themselves. So it gives the UN Security Council essentially the ability to step in and help to mediate conflicts, mediate disputes before they could spiral out of control into interstate war. Also, and even more powerfully, is Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which gives the UN Security Council the power to determine a threat to international peace and security, but more importantly, to authorize any means necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. And so this gives very, very broad powers to the UN Security Council. So it allows them to do things like initiate diplomatic sanctions, enforce economic sanctions, or even potentially authorize the use of military force by member states to put down an act of aggression from another state, or to authorize member states to step in and potentially even use military force against another country if it's deemed that that country is presenting a threat to international peace and security. So very, very important power, and one of the key ways in which the UN Security Council has an ability to override the sovereignty of states if they seem to be stepping over the bounds and threatening international peace and security. So under this, one of the key agents that the UN has used traditionally to try to help contain conflict, to try to help mediate some of these disputes and try to maintain international peace and security is UN peacekeeping forces. Probably one of the most visible arms of the United Nations. This is often what we think of, first and foremost, when we think of the UN, is the so-called blue helmet troops of the UN that we see working around the world, oftentimes driving white tanks or white armored personnel characters very clearly marked with UN. But it's interesting, as famous as UN peacekeepers have become, they're actually not included under the UN Charter. And kind of an interesting turn of fate that they were developed during the Cold War as a rapid reaction force that was created to help to resolve and mediate conflicts between state actors around the world. And they were created during the Cold War because of the stalemate in the UN Security Council between the US and the USSR. Essentially, the veto power under the UN Security Council allowed those two states to essentially block each other during the Cold War. And so the creation of UN peacekeepers were seen as a way to kind of work around that and to create a force that could go out into the world and try to resolve conflict before they started, even in the midst of this Cold War antagonism going on between the US and the USSR. And so UN peacekeeping forces are voluntary troops contributed from neutral member states. So any UN peacekeeping forces that you see operating around the world are provided by member states themselves, and even if they fly under the UN flag, and they are placed under the direct command of the UN. And UN peacekeeping forces traditionally used under that Chapter 6 provision, which means that they're usually used in situations with the consent of states or other actors involved, and usually without the mandate to engage in direct combat operations. So essentially, they're supposed to be invited in by states who want these peacekeepers to come in and help to keep a lid on a conflict situation. Or sometimes we see them often employed in post-conflict situations when wars have already settled down to help monitor things like ceasefires. So one example of UN peacekeeping forces out there in the world, which we've already seen during our unit on ethnic and nationalist conflict and our look at the case study of Rwanda, was those UNAMIR forces, which had moved in under General Romeo Dallaire at the time to try to help keep a lid on and monitor the Arusha peace agreement, which was going on before the genocide in Rwanda broke out. So traditionally, how have peacekeepers been used around the world to help contain conflict? Well, from your readings from the textbook for this module, they talk about different generations of peacekeepers that have operated around the world. And traditionally, in the first and second generation of peacekeeping operations, we see them primarily used for non-combat roles, so doing things like observation. So you might see UN peacekeepers sent into a country on behalf of the UN to monitor and report back on evolving security situations. So to be the UN's eyes on the ground, essentially. So to do things like monitor ceasefires. We've also seen peacekeepers traditionally used to monitor elections, make sure that they try to stay free and fair, or to potentially keep an eye on and monitor evolving human rights situations or potential human rights violations. More generally, though, they are also used for peacekeeping roles, and this is kind of where they get their name from, where these troops are often sent in between two warring groups or parties to try to help facilitate negotiation and communication between actors. So actually interposing themselves between two groups that might be in conflict with one another. Again, partly to serve as a channel of negotiation and communication, but also to kind of serve as a shield between those two parties, with the idea that if the UN peacekeeping troops are in the middle, then those two parties might not be able to get into direct conflict with one another. But this is an incredibly dangerous job, as you can imagine, because often peacekeepers are very lightly armed, and really their protection, for their protection, they rely on the fact that they are affiliated with the UN and that they are seen as neutral troops, and finally that they do have the consent of countries that invite them in the first place, and so ostensibly at least want them to be there. But putting yourselves between two warring factions is, of course, something that's incredibly dangerous, and we've seen thousands of peacekeepers die as a result of this, being caught up in these wars. And again, often relying on that UN affiliation. That's why you see the UN emblazoned very, very big on all of the vehicles that they use on the side of their blue helmets. They essentially want to be seen. And an interesting point of fact, it's actually a crime now under international law. It's considered a war crime under international law to target agents of the UN. And so, again, that's supposed to give them an added level of protection, but oftentimes that simply isn't enough. More recently, though, we have seen an evolution of peacekeepers from the UN towards other roles aside from observation or simple peacekeeping roles. And particularly after the end of the Cold War, kind of from 1992 on, we've witnessed an increasing mandate for the use of peacekeepers using military force in so-called peace enforcement or peace operations around the world, very often without the consent of host governments, or sometimes with only partial or coerced consent of state actors used. And also, instead of in post conflict environments, kind of monitoring things, or maybe pre conflict environments, we've seen many peacekeepers now being sent into situations of ongoing conflict with a very active combat role. And so, again, this is a huge change for how peacekeepers had traditionally been used. And instead of being used under those Chapter 6 provisions, again, often relying on the consent of state actors, since the end of the Cold War, we've increasingly seen peacekeepers being deployed under Chapter 7 provisions. And these are oftentimes used to engage in kind of humanitarian protection missions or longer term nation building activities within states themselves. So we've seen peacekeepers employed with a much stronger and more robust military combat mission to do things like include the protections of civilians, so actually use military force to protect civilian populations around the world, or to be able to use force as a military power to oversee things like governing and policing of countries, and maybe even involved in peace building and reconstruction in countries emerging from conflict. And one of the big ways that we've seen these peace enforcement operations unfold through UN peacekeepers is through the use of peacekeepers in missions of so-called humanitarian intervention. And these are missions under Chapter 7 that include the use of coercive means up to and including the use of military force by the UN, its member states, or their peacekeepers for purely humanitarian purposes to protect the security of civilian populations. So essentially what we're talking about with humanitarian intervention missions is sending in a force of combatants to go into situations where either major acts of violence, such as mass atrocities like ethnic cleansing or genocide, are unfolding in a country, or potentially major humanitarian crises or disasters that are threatening the lives of civilian populations in a country, to send those troops in with a very active military combat role to prevent that from happening. And what we've been seeing, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is the emergence of a so-called right to intervene, or a new norm of the right to intervene on the part of peacekeepers or the militaries of member states to protect international peace and security under Chapter 7. And so we've been seeing these protection missions of civilians being read in under Chapter 7 as a mission, as something that can potentially be a violation of international peace and security. But we've seen lots of debates around humanitarian intervention in the post-Cold War world. Definitely we've seen a lot of states pushing back against this perceived right to intervene of the international community and member states, because it does very much infringe upon those norms of state sovereignty that the US is the UN is also very much sworn to protect. Because obviously the right to intervene can often mean sending in troops across the borders of states and very much violating their state sovereignty. So we see a lot of tension there. There's also been a lot of critiques about how humanitarian intervention has unfolded in the post-Cold War world, with many critics pointing towards the ad hoc quality or the unequal application of this norm of humanitarian intervention around the world. So for instance, in the case of Somalia back in 1992, we did see the UN invoke Chapter 7 and send in peacekeeping forces, and also authorizing the use of force by other member states, such as the US, to go in and use all means necessary to establish a secure environment for humanitarian relief operations in Somalia. But then there were other cases that unfolded afterwards, later on in the post-Cold War world, where the UN should have stepped in, many might argue, but they didn't. One example, of course, being the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where we had those UN peacekeepers on the ground, but they never had a combat mission to engage to actually protect civilian populations. And as many might argue, that was a contributing factor in some ways towards the 800,000 to a million people killed there. Later on in Srebrenica in 1995, during the Yugoslav wars, we also saw another major massacre of civilians in Bosnia and Herzegovina who were in a so-called UN safe area at the time. But again, those UN soldiers on the ground didn't have a mandate to intervene to protect them. And what we saw was a genocide resulting in the deaths of over 8,000 people killed. So some would say, why do we see the UN intervening in some cases, but not others? A lot of critiques also that, particularly in the 1990s, there was very much a lack of clear guidelines for when, how, or by whom these interventions should and could be carried out. So when could an intervention actually be legitimate? How do we know? And so what we saw is toward the end of the 1990s, a very public call led by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General at the time, to try to develop some guidelines for humanitarian intervention within the United Nations. And what we saw was the creation of a new normative framework and guidelines to try to set out some rules to follow for legitimate humanitarian intervention that could be engaged in by the UN and UN peacekeeping forces. And this is the so-called Responsibility to Protect document that was developed by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, the ICISS. So they came up with this document after several months of work, this Responsibility to Protect, or R2P report, and presented it to the Secretary General in 2001. And it made really three key contributions to this debate around humanitarian intervention and when could humanitarian intervention be considered legitimate. One of those aspects of the debate was to try to reconceptualize this existing norm around the right to intervene by the international community as a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable citizens or civilians living within those state bodies. So again, the idea here was to try to refocus the debate over state sovereignty as saying that states themselves had a responsibility to ensure the human security or to ensure the human rights and protections of the citizens living within their own borders. So not saying that state sovereignty was an absolute right that states always had just by dint of being a state in the modern international system, but that state sovereignty came with an inherent responsibility to protect its civilians. And as the R2P document argued, if a state failed in that responsibility to protect its civilians either through direct action, maybe targeting those civilians itself, or through unwillingness or inaction to take an action to protect those citizens, then the responsibility to protect those civilian populations was then transferred up to the international community, and that was a role for the UN and other international actors to potentially step in and engage in this kind of humanitarian intervention. But very importantly, the R2P document also set out some very clear threshold criteria for when they thought legitimate interventions could be undertaken by the UN Security Council, the international community, and peacekeeping forces of the UN. One of the first threshold criteria was so-called just cause. So this was the idea of, was something horrific enough essentially happening to justify and make legitimate the use of humanitarian intervention. And so the guidelines that the R2P document chose was a serious and irreparable harm occurring or likely to imminently occur to human beings, resulting in large-scale loss of life. And so the R2P document set a very knowingly high bar for when they thought it might be justified to use intervention. And so what they had in mind was very physical threats that could result in large-scale loss of life. So essentially mass atrocities. So the use of things like genocide and ethnic cleansing, which we've talked about, the commission of war crimes on a mass scale, or other crimes against humanity. The second threshold criteria that R2P set out was the idea of right intention. So the idea that if humanitarian intervention ever was to be engaged in, it should be for humanitarian purposes. It should be undertaken in good faith and not as a smokescreen or a cover to intervene for other ulterior motives or for other ulterior purposes. Third, we had the principle of last resort, which meant that humanitarian intervention, if it was to be used, should only be used when all other non-military means have been exhausted. So recognizing the idea that infringing upon the sovereignty of a state to intervene, even if there's major large-scale humanitarian intervention that might be needed, should only happen in the worst case scenarios and when you've tried everything else possible and it hasn't worked. So try diplomatic solutions, tried economic solutions, and only if those don't work should military options be put on the table. Number 4 is proportional means, and the idea behind this is that the scale, duration, and intensity of interventions should be the minimum necessary to end suffering. So if you do have to intervene on the sovereignty of a state for humanitarian intervention, it should be to the minimum level possible to stop the humanitarian suffering that you're trying to put an end to. Last, we have the idea of reasonable prospects, and this is a bit of a utilitarian calculation. But the R2P document set out that intervention should only be used if there's a reasonable chance that that military intervention will actually succeed and it won't create consequences that are worse than not intervening in the first place. And as we know, in many cases of intervention, it can sometimes lead to results that potentially are worse in the long run. So the idea is that you could look ahead and try to weigh the calculations of it and ensure that you're not going to do more harm than good by intervening. So the R2P norm, this idea that perhaps there are legitimate times for states to intervene in mass humanitarian crises around the world, is something that's been evolving within the UN and increasingly becoming accepted within the UN as a major operational doctrine. So initially we had R2P being very warmly received by Secretary General Annan, and he included it in his high-level 1995 report for future aspects of UN reform. So saying moving forward with the UN should work towards adopting these basic principles of R2P. And in 2005, we saw this happen during the unanimous adoption by the General Assembly of the R2P principles at the United Nations World Summit. And this is something that you're actually going to get to see a little bit, the adoption of this in the video on our watch that you're going to watch on our case study of Darfur. In 2006, we also saw an affirmation by the UN Security Council under a UN Security Council resolution that they considered mass atrocities to be a core threat to international peace and security. And when these things started to unfold, so again, cases like genocide, ethnic cleansing, gross human rights violations, and crimes against humanity, there was indeed a responsibility to protect on behalf of the United Nations. And finally, in 2009, we saw a new UN report come out under Ban Ki-moon, the new Secretary General, who put a document forward about how the UN could actually start to implement the doctrines of R2P. And we actually have seen the responsibility to protect increasingly become a part of the conversation of the UN and how UN peacekeepers should be used. So R2P in practice in the 21st century, after it was adopted by the UN, it's been largely hit and miss. In the case study that we're looking at this week, the case study of the genocide in Darfur, despite the fact that the R2P document was evolving and being adopted in the UN at the same time the genocide was unfolding, we saw a real lack of implementation and operationalization by the UN Security Council during the genocide. So essentially, there was no movements made or resolutions passed to use R2P to authorize the use of UN peacekeeping forces to prevent the genocide in Darfur from unfolding further. However, in 2011, we did see the very first implementation of the R2P doctrine by the UN Security Council. And this was part of a Chapter 7 authorization that gave the UN and NATO forces the permission to intervene for humanitarian purposes in Libya under a UN Security Council resolution passed in March 2011. So the very, very first time that we actually saw the language of responsibility to protect used to go in and authorize military force to put down the Gaddafi regime, who at the time evidence was emerging was involved in mass atrocities against civilian populations. And so overall, what we've seen in the first decade of the 21st century is a growing acceptance of these R2P guidelines within the UN and a recognition that state sovereignty might no longer be an absolute in cases of mass atrocity, and when it occurs, that there might be a push towards this responsibility to protect civilian populations. But again, Oftentimes, the R2P doctrine doesn't play out in practice, as many of the readings that you're going to be looking at this week will take up and start talking about. So that's it for the online lecture portion of Module 7. After you finish this up, you can turn towards screening our documentary on our watch. Excellent, excellent documentary looking at these issues of humanitarian intervention and the specific case study of the genocide in Darfur, often referred to as the first genocide of the 21st century. It's about 50 minutes long, so set some time aside for that. When you finish the documentary, you can move on to completing the required readings. There's a brief reading from the textbook, Ramsbotham et al., on evolving peacekeeping forces. There's also readings from Cotti, Evans, and Bellamy, 3 article readings accompanying this, looking at issues of the evolution of peacekeeping, the evolution of humanitarian intervention, the responsibility to protect, and Bellamy in particular looks at how this is played out in the case study of Darfur. Once you finish the readings, you can move on to posting our threaded discussions. And last but not least, you can submit your reading response paper if you are signed up for this module. All right, that's all for now, guys. In Module 8, we're going to be turning towards looking at conflict resolution and conflict management with a look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.